Hello and welcome to That's What You Think, a podcast by global communications agency Cognito, where we invite guests, bold thought leaders, opinion leaders, chiefly on subject matter related to finance, technology and sustainability. My guest today is Rade Musulin. Rade's a principal at Finity Consulting. It's a actuarial and data analytics firm. Rade's US trained. He's now an Australian actuary. And has been Actuary of the Year with 45 years experience, deeply involved in climate modelling here, public and policy framework, has experience in international politics, represented his US employer on political and policy matters in Florida and Washington, including being chair of Florida Insurance Council, and also last year provided testimony at the US Senate Committee on the Budget regarding the impact of climate change on insurance markets as well as catastrophe responses in the US. Welcome, Rade. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here.
Great to have you. I'm just going to quote a few things verbatim because I thought this was interesting. Over 6 months ago, so just at the beginning of February, a week or so after Donald Trump's second inauguration, you sent me a few things which I think have proved to be quite insightful as things have played out. I'm just going to quote a few of them. You wrote to me in this email, many countries are going to struggle with this because Trump is totally transactional, poorly versed in facts, and prone to impulsive decisions. The EU and Australia think about rules, order, and negotiation of agreements. That stuff is out the window with Trump. Just keep in mind, this is at the very beginning of February 2025. In his first term, some of his bad impulses were restrained by his professional staff. We now see he has surrounded himself with a very different staff. The US system was specifically designed to stop this level of overreach from happening. When will the US system push back? And lastly, every tenet of mainstream economics says that Trump tariff behavior is self-defeating and will lead to balkanization of trade, less prosperity and a difficult environment for business planning. And we'll see whether economics profession is right or Trump is right. So I just wanted to open by looking back over the last 6 months since you sent me those comments and attempting to make sense of or separate the method from the madness of this second term so far.
Well, things have largely played out as I would have expected them to. And you have to remember, if you go back in Donald Trump's life over the past several decades, he's been remarkably consistent about a number of things. He's very transactional, as I said earlier. He also has a zero-sum worldview where he does not believe in win-win situations. He believes in transactions where there's a winner and a loser. He wins, you lose, you win, he loses. And therefore, he conducts his foreign policy on the basis of trying to use leverage over other countries, be that leverage through tariffs, lawsuits, military, whatever it may be, to try to extract concessions. And he does that not only with countries, but with universities, with the media, with all other people in the Congress, etc. He also doesn't really study policy. He doesn't read the briefing binders. He doesn't rely on the advice of experts and gets a lot of his information from television. Now, that gives him a very uncanny and remarkable understanding of seeing events the way his supporters see them on television. And it gives him a very close feel for what the pulse of the public is. And he's used that to tremendous advantage. One thing he's been very consistent about, he's seen the carnage which has occurred in the American heartland for workers who've been displaced by largely competition from Asia, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, places like that. And that's resulted in people's families falling apart, because remember, there's no safety net in the United States, really. There's no Medicare, very poor unemployment insurance. So you've seen communities and states decimated by a lot of this trade, and he's had his finger on the pulse of that. And that's one reason why he's been so strong on tariffs, because he believes that's a way to restore manufacturing in the United States, et cetera. And I guess the last thing I would basically note is that, he's very impatient. And he expects immediate results. I mean, how many times have you seen a tweet where he says, I want it immediately in all caps? Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of the world doesn't work that way. And trade agreements often take years to negotiate, not hours. And so I think when you put all of that together and you understand that that's been Donald Trump's persona for decades, a lot of what you're seeing right now makes a lot of sense, and it's not surprising.
And so we've been through 6 months. I guess we have another 7 instances of these left. It feels like a long time in terms of the dramatic shift in policies. I remember we spoke a while back when sort of Ezra Klein first resurfaced that PBS interview from Steve Bannon about sort of flooding the zone with at muzzle velocity. And I think that was a real shock from the outset. He really owned the media globally, and there wasn't a day that went past without something dramatic happening. And as an actuary, it's your job to model risks. And we talked a little bit the other day about the unknown risks that I guess might come from a systemic shock to, in this case, trade and international trade, trade tariffs, shifts in manufacturing, shifts in relationships with countries between the US and those doing business with the US and China. That there's a lot that could happen we may not know yet, but can you talk a little bit about maybe where those shifts and volatility might come from as some of these trade relationships and tariffs stick? Perhaps some don't, but it's certainly going to cause big changes in the way the world works.
Well, yeah, and maybe to start with your initial comment before I answer your question, the whole issue of muzzle velocity and flooding the zone with excrement, I won't say the real word he said on the podcast, is a strategy designed with some very specific things in mind. It's first meant to dull the listener, the public, to some things that are going on. If you have an outrage every week or every day, then things that used to appear incredible or would have brought down another president just seem normal. The other thing it does is creates a lot of distractions. So if you do something which creates a bad outcome, you can shift to something else immediately and take the public's attention off it. And I can give you some examples of that later. And I think the third thing it's intended to do is to keep people off balance, to just basically overwhelm them with so much information, so much change, that they don't really see the master plan or the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. Now, to more specifically answer your question, I think, what you're really seeing is a process of organized chaos, and where boundaries are being pushed in many areas where they haven't been pushed anywhere near this far before. And in arena after arena, be it the courts, the constitutional norms, the world order that's been built up, international relations, human rights, you name it. Trump is going way outside the bounds of what's ever been done in the past. That's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. That's just an observation. And Scott, I think what this does is it creates a situation where you've got an incredibly complex world system, be it supply chains, economics, government debt markets, et cetera, that has really never been stressed in the way it's being stressed right now. And systems that complicated that get stressed in unusual ways can have unusual results. Things can pop out of nowhere like the GFC did when that CDO operation in London, went bust and Lehman Brothers collapsed. We're prone to those type of shocks right now. And so I think we need to be on guard for that sort of stuff because there's a lot of stress being put on the system.
Yeah. And I guess one of the groups of players in this business that was taken off guard were certainly politicians. And I think it was a real shock to those who had been used to doing business diplomatically and quietly and through various trade representatives and having done things in a measured pace previously. Suddenly they had to use a different playbook. And I know you've used the term from rules to relationships in terms of how you have to work with the current US administration. Can you talk about that a little bit, I guess, partly through an Australian lens of how we're doing here, and maybe how that might have precipitated a different approach or a different pace to our approach with relations with China?
Yes, well, I think the thing that is going to be difficult is it's hard for people to change behaviors that they've grown up with for their whole lives. I mean, I know in Australia, you see people, for example, standing at crosswalks when there's a red signal there, even when there's not a car in sight. That means we follow rules here. We tend to be very driven by probity and process and things like that. And we're now in an environment where in the United States, that's not really happening a lot right now. And you also have a lot of really unusual outcomes you're seeing. Like, as an example, when the tariffs were lowered in Europe to 15%, you had US automakers who were actually paying higher tariffs for their materials from Mexico than a European automaker was paying to ship a car into the United States. That's creating all kinds of distortions. Things like that. Now, I'm sure they'll correct that as we go on. But the point being that businesses caught in that situation have got some very difficult things to deal with, because you generally would not have let that situation occur if you'd thought out a well-developed policy across the whole world. So there's all these sort of cracks and unusual outcomes occurring right now that require businesses to be very agile. They're going to need to think about how to operate in a world of much greater uncertainty than they've been used to in quoting the Outback Steakhouse the theme in the United States, no rules, just right. And I think the businesses are going to have to become agile and resilient and understand how to operate in this. And they may well find that there are temporary anomalies, like the one I noted with the tariffs in Mexico and the EU, which may be reversed a month later. So I'd say don't overreact to what you're seeing.
Rade, we talked a little bit about sort of an Albanese scorecard, how he's doing with the White House. He's managed to sort of dodge Trump a little bit. And if we look at Keir Starmer's appearances in the Oval Office, maybe that's a good thing. But there are other leaders in other countries that I think have a more direct relationship with regard to the personal relationships with Trump. And you mentioned Bolsonaro and Brazil's Lula. And I'm interested to see your thoughts on how that's playing out.
Well, actually, President Lula does not have much of a relationship. He actually said the other day that he has not spoken to President Trump, and he feels like he hasn't been treated with respect. And this is interesting. I was in Brazil in May at an international actuarial meeting, and it was interesting to watch Brazilian television and talk to the Brazilians, because this was just occurring during a period when some of these threats against President Lula were being made, and he was actually in Beijing for a week, cutting trade deals and having discussions with the Chinese at the same time he was being threatened. And I think if you look at the threats of 50% tariffs on Brazil, a country that runs a trade deficit, the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil. So Brazil has a trade deficit. It's a country that supplies 30% of the U.S. coffee imports, which directly affects people in their morning cup of coffee and the cost of it. And yet you've got 50% tariffs placed on that country for what does not appear to be any economic reason, but instead a political reason, because ex-President Bolsonaro is being prosecuted for trying to stage a coup. And so I think what that shows is that there's much more to this tariff stuff than just economics and trade. It's also a way that the U.S. is exerting leverage, or attempting to, over other countries. And I don't think that's going to be successful in many cases, because I don't think a lot of foreign leaders can actually cave into that kind of pressure and keep their own jobs. Because, it's one thing to agree to a tariff or something like that, but to basically stop a prosecution and undermine your judicial system because you've been threatened is a very, very difficult thing for someone like President Lula to do.
Yeah, and the implementation of trade tariffs, obviously there's some historical quotes from Reagan about why he didn't like them, and I guess generally economically there's a sense the world will be better off with freer trade rather than more restrictive trade. One of the other things that is a globalized dynamic is climate change, and it's, I guess, disheartening for anybody who has been excited by the pace of change in regard to decarbonisation, net zero policies by government and adherence to those, industries getting behind them, big businesses building it into their long-term strategies of how do I offset, how do I decarbonize, how do I get behind a government's net zero commitments. These are not fads. They're not things that fanatics do. They're things that big businesses do strategically over 10 and 20-year periods to meet, as it is in Australia, safeguard mechanism baselines and things like that over many, many years. So it's serious stuff. And then when you watch someone come along and commit to such a reversal in not just policy but philosophy on climate change, it's disheartening. And I'm keen to hear your take on how much long-term damage this might do to global climate change policy.
Well, there's no question that there is huge damage being done. President Trump has gone in and undermined a lot of President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. There's been significant retrenchment in green energy standards, EV mandates. They've repealed the power of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate greenhouse gas pollution. There's been a huge push for fossil fuel exports, basically a gutting of scientific research, scientific monitoring, turning off some of the satellites that are monitoring things and deleting databases. I mean, it's like going into a hospital and turning off the EKG machines because we don't want to hear the, bad outcomes. So I think in the short to medium term, that is going to do a lot of damage, and it is going to make it much harder for other countries to pursue strong decarbonization when you've got one of the leading countries in the world turning away from it. But in the long run, I think that the United States is swimming against the tide in this case. And the tide is strong, and it is going to result in decarbonization in the long run. And that's for several reasons. First of all, the Chinese are going to push it hard. So are the Europeans, so are the Australians, and so are many countries in Asia. And that's a powerful economic bloc. Secondly, you're going to see significant climate-related disasters. That's going to create public support for decarbonization. And three, the technology is coming along so quickly and so powerfully. The cost of renewables is dropping. Green energy makes sense. And I think that if you look at this from a longer term perspective, it's hard to see how any U.S. administration can really derail global decarbonization. And that's why I'm, certainly personally strongly committed that, Finity to, helping companies in Australia, navigate the standards, and I'm a strong supporter of them here. And I think in the United States, eventually the U.S. will reverse course and come back to the party, so to speak, on climate. The problem is that it will be so far behind China and Europe and Australia and other countries that it's going to really put the U.S. at a serious economic disadvantage over time.
And then just quickly touching back on the method versus madness, I guess one of the concerns you would have if you were a large multinational corporation with various subsidiaries in different domiciles and things, you'd be concerned, is this a 4-year anomaly, or will some of this stuff work and stick beyond those 4 years? Or do you remain tactical for those 4 years? I'm just curious from an international business lens, are big businesses taking this on as temporary aberrations, albeit sort of medium term rather than short term? Or are these things which there may be some benefits either politically or economically for the next US leader to leave in place?
Well, let me actually answer your question for the small business perspective first. I read a story this week about a small business that after the first round of tariffs as a United States business had tried to shift production from China, where there was a threat of 145% tariffs, to Cambodia, where there was at the time a 10% tariff. They went through months of moving their supply chains to Cambodia, and then lo and behold, months later, the China tariff drops and the Cambodia tariff is higher, and now they're in a real jam. And there's a high likelihood that there's going to be some structural problems like that with a lot of small businesses in the United States, which may be counterparties of Australian businesses. So I would note that the larger firms are much better positioned to deal with that type of uncertainty and volatility than small firms are. And I think to your question, it is going to require larger firms, I think, to diversify their markets and in some ways go around the United States and form trading bonds with countries that are not going through all this rapid change, and build relationships where there are no tariffs, where there is policy certainty, et cetera. In terms of how much of this is going to survive to the next administration or even the next year with a current administration, there's a couple of variables there. Some of it's going to depend on how much pain is inflicted on the United States economy and consumers. If you see small businesses closing, farmers not being able to harvest crops, inflation occurring because there's no coffee in the stores, you're going to see a backlash that may have President Trump correct some of these things. Longer term, it's going to be difficult to unwind a lot of these tariffs to the degree that they stick, because they're going to create economic distortions or at least economic reactions to the situation. You may see various companies entrench pricing and practices in the United States that it's going to create a political constituency against unrolling some of this stuff. So I think it's going to create conditions that is going to be difficult for any future administration to undo completely.
Okay. And I guess new sort of incidental supply markets where industries might be set up around the framework of a tariff and stay in place because they end up thriving for whatever reason.
Well, Scott, one thing you have to remember is the markets are incredibly clever and very innovative and very diverse. And if you have somewhat incomplete policies, blanket tariffs, and then there's exemptions here and changes there, you are going to see situations where the markets find ways around that and find ways to cope with it. And I think that could manifest itself in lots of ways, diversifying supply chains, having creative resupply or re-import export markets, exchange rate fluctuations, all kinds of things over a period of time are going to rebalance the system. So I do think the business community and the rest of the world will adapt. I think more of the effect's going to be on the United States than countries outside the United States.
Okay. I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about this acceleration of the divergence between the US and China. And I guess for a long time, much of the world's been taught that China is the challenger, and in some circumstances, the enemy. And certainly at the moment, the US seems very hungry for power and wants to proactively be a superpower. China seemingly is incidentally a superpower because of the size of its economy, and it has more of a liability-driven sort of growth agenda to feed and support its population. Nonetheless, two big economic powerhouses being seen very differently as these policies play out, and you watch the policy statements from the US, the response from China, and then the rest of the world start to do business differently with both economies. Can you talk a little bit about this divergence in policy between the two?
Well, I think the divergence in policy starts with a divergence in national interests and culture. And I think the policy divergence is just a consequence of that. Culturally, the Chinese practice a lot of strategic patience. You can go back and read The Art of War from centuries ago, and a lot of the Chinese literature. I actually studied Chinese history in university, and it was fascinating actually going back and reading all that and seeing how the current government in China is actually a continuation in many ways of things that have been there for centuries. Yep. And China is a resource poor country. They do not have a lot of oil, gas, fossil fuels. So it's natural that they're going to push for things like decarbonization, green power, and all the things that they're doing right now. On the other hand, the United States is characterized by an entrepreneurial spirit. You have a leader in the United States who's very short-term and transactional. You've got an abundance of fossil fuels. and so forth. And so I think when you look at those two situations, the way the countries are behaving are actually very, very predictable. And in some ways, it's not just President Trump in the United States, but it's an entire playing to their strengths of, the dominance of the dollar, the trade, with basically having a huge consumer market, abundance of fossil fuels, all the things that are happening right now to some extent reflect that. Whereas the Chinese are doing things which actually reflect their strengths. And I think in the long run, the Chinese position is probably the stronger one because they hold a few, pardon the pun, trump cards right now, like rare earths, which are going to create some significant complications for the U.S.
Yeah. And I know you do a lot of work on climate. I know that the pace of change with regard to renewables and infrastructure development in China is real breakneck stuff. And you talk about them being less fossil fuel rich, whereas the US has plenty of resources and probably untapped resources. Is there any sense of forgiveness that, well, why wouldn't the US embark on this policy of trying to capture low-cost energy for this next period of growth, while China would naturally capitalize on the fact that it doesn't have these fuels and therefore will look to electrification of its economy? Obviously, that has implications for the climate. Putting that aside for 1 second, again, is there method to the madness in the US? And what are the global implications of a reversal in this kind of climate policy?
Well, it's interesting that economic policies and climate policies may quickly come into conflict. If you look at, for example, the trade deal that was just announced with the European Union a few days ago, where the tariffs were lowered to 15%, and then there was a deal for the European Union to import large quantities of U.S. energy in the form of liquefied natural gas and petroleum products, and then also make a lot of investments in the United States. Well, that's somewhat at odds with the European Union's commitment for net zero and to decarbonize, and it's almost impossible to see how they're going to actually fulfill that agreement and import all those fossil fuels and still hit their climate targets. And that's one reason why the Trump administration has been railing against climate mandates and EVs and windmills and solar power and all that stuff, because it does cut down the market for U.S. fossil fuel exports. So I think there's going to be a conflict between policies here that you're going to see in many areas. And I would note the Chinese, on the other hand, have been going all in on electrification, solar, wind power, manufacturing enormous amounts of the infrastructure that's needed for all that stuff. And they've also got the Belt and Road Initiative, which has created a logistics network, globally to distribute a lot of this stuff. And so I think, I don't know whether you say forgive or anything. It's not a value judgment. It's just a reality of where the two countries are placed. And I do think that in the short run, the United States at the moment is trying to encourage fossil fuel use and U.S. exports of fossil fuel to balance the trade deficit, and also to obviously make money from fossil fuels, and to use the tariffs to sort of give countries like Japan, Korea, the EU, an incentive to import U.S. fossil fuels. Now, whether that's going to survive in the long run is another question.
Yeah, okay. Domestically, how Australia is positioned is something that will be of interest to a lot of people watching. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts on, where are the potential trade advantages for Australia? We have obviously a very different resource makeup to a lot of our friends and neighbours in the region here, who may be having a better or worse time doing business with the US at the moment. And there's also these anomalies that pop up whereby, not dissimilar to the proxy trade routes to try and get around country-specific tariffs, but being able to operate out of Australia in order to do business with a region that the US is not very friendly with at the moment. I'd love to hear your take on how we're faring here and where the opportunities for Australian business and politicians are.
Well, I think we're very well positioned for a whole host of reasons. For one thing, we're far less dependent on trade with the United States than a lot of other countries. We've got much more trade with Asia and China at the moment. Secondly, I think we've got an abundance of food. We export food to the rest of the world. We have a number of critical minerals that are required for decarbonization and to fuel the green economy. We've got massive opportunities to export that. We've got a lot of renewable energy potential. We get solar, wind, et cetera here, which can power a green economy and do so cheaply and efficiently. We've got an excellent university system, which has generated a very well-educated workforce, and we can actually replace some of the university positions for foreign students that are being made difficult in the United States. We can actually export education. And we're seen, just two other things, we're seen as a bastion of kind of stability and rule of law in this region. So in that sense, we can really become a leader in this area. And I think if you just sort of wrap all that up, I think we've put ourselves in a very strong position, partly too because of our social safety net. And I just would like to take 1 second and explain what I mean by that. The decarbonization is going to create a lot of disruption. You're going to have maybe coal miners lose jobs. You're going to have jobs shift to different parts of the country, and that's going to create a dislocation for some people. When that happened in the United States, there was no healthcare system to speak of to take care of people. You lose your job, you lose your health insurance, and that led to a lot of the problems that have fueled Donald Trump's rise. Well, here we've got a strong Medicare system, we've got a strong social safety net, we've got a very powerful middle class, unions, a lot of things, and I think that will help us get through this transition a lot smoother than other countries. So in summary, Scott, I think we're in a really excellent position here to prosper in the next several decades.
And this, as China carries on with its sort of Belt and Road Initiative in this region and across regions where it needs to be accessible for trade and for energy and infrastructure, do you see the Asia Pacific becoming closer? And is there anything that's happening politically that you see playing out quite differently now that it was, let's say, in the last sort of US administration? Because China will be trying to do business with countries in this region, will be doing business with China and other countries in the region, and there will be probably a sense among those countries that they're a little dirty on the policy that's been thrust upon them from the US in the last 6 months. Just a little bit of a pulse check on the APAC region and doing business in the APAC region.
Well, I think there's no doubt that the APAC region is one which is dynamic and is in a kind of strange place because it's very vulnerable to the United States in the short run, particularly some of the Asian economies like South Korea, Vietnam, Bangladesh on exports of clothing, textiles, things like that in China. We're not as vulnerable to that, nor are some other countries like Indonesia and some other places. So it's kind of a mixed bag in the short run of where the distortions are going to occur. But I think you may see a redirection of trade into Asian and also with Latin America. We shouldn't forget, Brazil and some countries there are very powerful and important potential markets. So I think you're going to see like a rebalancing of the economy towards Asia, towards regional cooperation. India's got a huge market that's a great opportunity for Australia, given our English-speaking background there with both countries. And so I think over a period of time, you're going to see a somewhat irreversible shift towards trade around the United States to places like Latin America, Asia, et cetera. And the United States will still be important, but I think that a lot of damage has been done to the U.S. just position of stability. And so people are going to have to rebalance their portfolios, so to speak, or nations rebalance their trade to make it less vulnerable to the U.S.
As we begin to wrap up, I might posit a couple things, and I'll get you to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing, which is probably difficult and dangerous, but interesting nonetheless. We talked a little bit the other day about, how far the Trump administration might stretch this unitary executive theory in terms of policy implementation and bypassing congressional support for certain things before they encounter political weakness, and we've already seen the sort of the MAGA base go against the executive branch in terms of things that are happening in the headlines at the moment. We don't need to get into that, but what are those kinds of fractures that might develop as a result of sort of systemic overreach in the US? Given we're so early on into this term, any predictions or expectations as to how things might play out sort of politically within the...
Yeah, let me make one observation, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying about complex systems and damaging them or stressing them and them having weird reactions. There's been a lot of turmoil in the U.S. Civil service. And we saw hints of how that may cause problems in the Texas floods recently, where FEMA couldn't put people into Texas for, I think, 2 to 3 days because it required the personal signature of the secretary in order to spend more than $100,000. You've seen a gutting of Social Security Administration jobs that tens of millions of Americans depend on for checks every month and benefits and stuff like that. You're seeing significant portions of the Veterans Administration hospital system, for example, be put under threat. You've got Health and Human Services trying to undermine vaccines, and now you got a measles outbreak in parts of the U.S. So there's a lot of these things kind of going on, and the small business thing I mentioned before, where small businesses are getting whipsawed by tariffs. So you've got a lot of places where they can be discontent if things kind of go the wrong way. People can't get anybody on the phone at the government. You don't get an emergency response if there's a big hurricane. Those things can take on a life of their own that can't be controlled by the politicians. You get a massive hurricane and there's a relief disaster. Just like happened in the past. I mean, we had Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. We've had problems in the Biden and Obama administration. So this isn't unique to this, but it's all going to get blamed on the Doge cuts and all that. You also then have a lot of constituencies in the United States, farmers as an example. I used to work for the Farm Bureaus. I know this very well, who are losing through the immigration crackdown, the workers in the meatpacking plants and who pick the vegetables and fruits. That's going to create a big increase in meat prices and things in the United States. You've got construction workers who aren't going to be able to repair houses because all the construction workers, or many of them, who've been rounded up in immigration raids because there's a large proportion of migrants doing construction work. So I think when you put all this together, there's a lot of storm clouds on the horizon. And I think at some point, one or more of those things is going to cause a problem. And I don't have a crystal ball on which thing it's going to be that's going to become a problem. But when you combine that with inflation induced by tariffs and small business problems with all this and a lot of other things, I think you're going to see some backlash in the United States. And it's going to come from the public. It's going to come from strange places that you don't expect to see it. You've got a lot of government workers and their families, friends, and people in their communities who've been laid off. They're going to go vote starting in November this year in Virginia and New Jersey in governor races. So, you could see some backlash against the Republicans through some of this. And that's going to create some momentum to stiffen the spines of some Republicans in Congress to stand up.
And when you talk about it in those terms, it feels like there's probably some volatility to come in the data, but when it is very early days and we're not necessarily seeing that yet, and that would be something that would be difficult to disguise or hide from. And I guess as an actuary, in terms of trying to model for economic shocks and things like that, is there any sense of when these fractures might begin to show up in U.S. economic data?
I think it's going to happen before Christmas because right now, see a lot of things are happening, like inventories were built up before the tariffs went in. They're now being drawn down. You've got, you haven't seen a lot of the supply chain being disrupted yet. The effect of the tariffs hasn't really hit in prices, but some of these price increases for tariffs are pretty big. I mean, you've got, copper prices, going up. Of course, today they just announced that some of it was going to exempt and they fell. But, a lot of this pressure in the economy on prices has to start to show up in the next few months in the data. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the government and people react to that when it starts to happen.
Fascinating, Rade. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you joining me. And it sounds like we'll watch and see how all these externalities play out and the different parts of the market fill the gaps to cater for the shocks they've experienced.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great to be here.
Thank you.